So hi Matt, thanks for joining us on this quick segment to kind of explain to people the intricacies of the upper tier of comic book grading.
Sure, glad to be here.
So one of the questions I think a lot of people have asked us over the last few months is what the typical condition a brand new comic would be in a comic book retailer, like on New Comic Book Day, versus the types of comics that come in that earn those very coveted high-end grades of 9.8, 9.9, and 10.
Well, there's two things to consider. There's the printing process for the comic books, and then there's obviously the shape the books are in when they're out for display at a store to be bought. Obviously, if they're at a store, they've passed through a few hands, so it's possible they might be they have small defects on them at that point. But before that, the printing process is actually a source of a lot of defects for certain books. Going back to the 30s and 40s, the 50s and 60s, there's been a lot of different kinds of printing defects that we've seen on books. And they vary depending on the publisher, the type of paper used, the printing process, and they vary. 40s defects are very different from 60s and 80s. And today we actually see a unique set of printing defects, and mainly it's because of the cheap paper that the publishers use. And some publishers use better paper than others, but we've noticed that, I guess, with print media dying out, there's been a push for cheaper material just because of the cost involved. So actually today we're seeing a lot of books that come in with certain defects, and they might be like color missing on the spine, maybe the inks have been smeared, or maybe the paper is kind of wavy. Because it's cheap and it's not completely flat when it comes off the press. And so these are things that sometimes we count off for, but it depends really on how many copies were affected. So when books come in, new comics are released, we usually get a lot of copies to be graded. And what we'll do is when we see so many at once, we can gauge how many copies are affected by a particular defect we may see on a book. And if we see a lot of copies or most copies that are affected by the same defect, we'll actually create a grading curve for that particular defect on that particular book. So for instance, there's, I believe, a Spidey 700. It's a very thick book that came out a while back, and because it's so thick, and this is a problem in Golden Age 2 when the books were a lot thicker back then, when the paper's folded and stapled, the thickness of the paper causes the top and bottom spine area to pop and cause like a little tear. We call that a bindery tear. So typically we'll downgrade to, say, a 9.6 for that, but for that particular book, we let them pass and give them 9.8s. So that's one example of how the printing process can actually affect the grade of a book. You know, even though you'd think it'd be perfect when it comes off the printer, it's not, because it's very fragile. It's just paper. So once it goes through the printing process, then it goes to distribution. So they're handled there because they're stacked into orders that go out to the different retailers who sell them. And so you got some handling there, and of course when they get to the stores or wherever they're being sold, they're put out on display for sale. So by the time somebody gets their copy, it's been through a few hands, it's been through the printing process, and often you might find defects on those books.
Right, so what would you say, like, you know, walking into a store on a Wednesday, your typical comic book that's just been put out is going to grade? I mean, what's the range you would expect to see?
9.8 is usually where we cap out. The vast majority of our highest graded books are 9.8. 9.9 and 10.0 are the coveted grades, and those are very rare. We only give out a handful of those per month. Basically, a 9.8 can have a couple of small defects, some of the things we mentioned before, maybe some slight blunting to the corners, or in the case of older books, yellowing, a little yellowing, or transfer stains would be okay. Transfer stain is just part of the aging process to the cover. But 9.9 and 10 are reserved for books that are virtually perfect in every way. There's not a single stress line on the spine. The corners are razor sharp. And even with the new comic books, there might be 1 out of 1,000 that might get a 9.8. I'm sorry, a 9.9 or a 10.0. So 9.8 is typically the highest grade that one could expect on a book.
Right, but more typically you're probably looking at 9.4s, 9.6s based on the amount of handling.
Sure, of course, yeah. For modern comics, absolutely, yeah. I mean, we'll get in, 100 copies of the same book. Inevitably, some of those are going to end up 9.6 or 9.4. It depends on how well they were preserved by the person who owns them, or how well they were printed. But yeah, sometimes they'll be 9.6 or 9.4, and you see that as you go back, it gets a lot more common. 80s books. 9.8s are harder. By the time you get back to the 1960s, 9.8s are really, really rare. Typically a 9.4 is actually a really high grade on that book, and part of that again has to do with not only the printing and the handling, but also at that point the aging, because those books are 50, 60 years old.
How about books that have predominantly black covers? Those seem to me to be just fingerprint magnets. Is it very difficult to find high-grade comics like Spider-Man 36, the 9/11 issue would be an example. I mean, that's all solid black. I mean, it must be even difficult to grade that book without imparting fingerprints on it.
Yeah, I mean, we keep our hands clean, obviously, when we're grading them, and I'd like to think most collectors in this day and age keep their hands clean as well. But yeah, black covers are historically harder to find in high grade. Again, very true for the earliest books when they weren't handled very carefully. Yeah, because they show every little thing, fingerprints, color breaks. So yeah, those are typically the books that are the hardest to find. Spider-Man 28. From the 60s, House of Secrets 92, Marvel Spotlight 5, the Spider-Man 36 that you mentioned. So yeah, those are typically in a run the hardest ones, the ones that you find the least number of 9/8s or even 9/6s in.
So can you sort of give a sort of a Cliff's Notes rundown of the sort of the differences between the grades, starting, let's just say, at like 9.2 up to perfect?
Yeah, so when you're up in the 9.8 to 10.0 range, there's a lot of factors that have to be there for all the books. White pages, perfect, the gloss needs to be there. There can't be any kind of stains or fingerprints. Typically you get into physical wear like color breaks. Spine stress lines is probably the biggest thing. And then also tiny edge wear, blunted corners, and creases. So for an example, a spine stress line, which is, they can be long or short. They may break color, they may not break color. So those are all factors. So like for instance, obviously a 10.0 can have 0 spine stress lines. A 9.9 can have one tiny little stress line, maybe that breaks color in the slightest, on the spine, or maybe 1 or 2 that don't break color, that are pretty much imperceptible through the holder. 9.8 can have 1 or 2 small color breaking stress lines, but again, very tiny. And this is assuming the rest of the book is perfect. And then from there on down, 9.6 would have, say, 4 or 5 stress lines. 9.4 can have 7 or 8. 9.2 would be 10 or 11. 9.0 would be like 12 to 15. But again, these all depend on whether they break color or how long they are. The ones I'm describing may break color, but can't be more than maybe like 1/32 or 1/16 of an inch. When they start getting longer, then the number gets fewer. That's allowed in each grade.
What about like color muting? Things like, you see a lot of Silver Age books that otherwise are sharp and crisp, corners, edges, but the color on the cover may be degrading. Some of the brighter colors may be fading out. Is that a major factor? Is that going to keep a comic from earning like a 9.2, 9.4?
Only if it's faded. There's kind of a spectrum when it comes to colors. Most books from the 60s, for example, fall somewhat towards the full color spectrum, we'll call it, because there's always a little bit of aging that comes into play that'll mute the colors, but occasionally we'll get the ones that they look like they're dripping wet, like they were printed yesterday. That might be from storage conditions, but that also might be from the print run, because during the print run, when they're printing off 200,000-300,000 copies, they'd have to refill the inks, and so as soon as they refill them, the first copies off the press look like the colors, like I said, are just so deep and rich, and then that slowly fades over time until they decided to refill the inks. So within that doesn't affect grade. That affects eye appeal, but in a positive way. So you've got basically the average colors you get on a print run are going to be acceptable in any grade, but the ones that are exceptional can actually be worth more because they have better eye appeal. But when you get into fading or yellowing, that's where you start to affect the grade. Yellowing is not really affecting the colors, but mainly turning the color yellow, which is most obvious in the white areas where there is no color. But fading is the worst. That's the one that's going to bring the grade way down, and that's if it's exposed to light, because light's going to fade the colors, particularly reds, blues. Black's not really affected, but you can tell if a book's faded just because the reds look more orange. And one way you can tell is if you flip the book over and look at the reds in the back cover, and if they don't match the reds in the front, then that's an indication it's been faded. And fading can be slight, knock it down into the 8s. It could be, moderate into the 6s, or it can be a complete washout, which we knock it down to 3 or even 4.0 at that point. And then there's also times where a print run may have uneven color distribution across the covers. So it might be red on one side that kind of grades into an orange. But we don't count off for that. So a lot of people mistake that for fading because obviously they got red and orange here. But you have to be able to kind of tell by looking at a book, how the light was hitting it. You can usually tell if it's faded or if it has something to do with printing.
Over the summer, Heritage Auctions sold a amazing CGC 9.4 copy of Captain America #1, and I see in a few months they're going to be selling a 9.4 Marvel Comics #1. What's it like in the grading room when masterpieces like that come in at such high grade?
Oh, we love it. Yeah, everybody stops and they come take a look and they ooh and they ah. Obviously, we don't see books like that very often. This is the highest graded Marvel Comics one that we've ever done, yeah, it's spectacular. I mean, it's 75 years old, or actually 80 years old. So it's it's unbelievable to think that a book would have survived that whole time in this condition. And the Captain America one, same thing. I mean, when it came in, we had it's actually from a famous collection. Both of them are. Different collections, but the Cap one was missing for decades, and this is true for a lot of famous collections, books that people had seen back in the 70s and 80s, and then they vanished into a collection. So yeah, when they pop up here, it's like, oh great, I've been waiting 20 years to see this book, and it's just as beautiful as I was hoping it would be. So yeah, we're always excited to get that stuff in the grading room.
CGC's sister company, NGC, grades coins, and they've been in the business for over 30 years. You'd think at this point that in the coin grading business that they would have seen and known about everything that's out there, but things still keep coming out of the woodworks that are even surprising to the professional coin graders. How long do you think it's going to take for the comic book industry to get a firm grasp on all of the amazing stuff that's still out there that's unaccounted for?
It's going to be a long time because you've got the Golden Age, the people who bought Golden Age and kept them as kids. They're now in their 90s, so they're pretty much passing away. That generation is passing away, and when that happens, usually their books come out for sale. The family, sells the books off. So we're seeing Golden Age. Most of it's come out at this point. But a lot of it was also coming out in the 60s and 70s when the hobby was starting to go. And what happened there was the new collectors back then that were buying those books, they're only in their 60s now. And maybe they've had books for 40, 50 years, or 40 years that they bought in the 70s. So I think those books are the ones that we're not going to see coming out for at least another 10, 20, 30 years. And in there are going to be some spectacular books that I'm sure we don't even know exist yet. So, and then as far as beyond that Silver Age, the baby boomers buying those, there's still a number of collections out there, but a lot of that's come out recently because of the popularity of the movies, CGC and the marketplace and the internet. It's just become such an easy way to sell books, and obviously they're worth so much money that's bringing a lot of this stuff out there. So, but we're kind of in the middle of it. I mean, we're in, I don't know, maybe like the 5th or 6th or 7th inning right now. We've got a lot more time and a lot more books to grade out there. I mean, we're still seeing amazing stuff coming in every day, and we've been open for 20 years.
Was it in the Bronze Age of comic book publication when collectors started getting really fastidious about bagging and boarding comics? I mean, is this when care of comics became a priority concern?
Yeah, I'd say probably the 80s, maybe late 70s and 80s, and then by the 90s it really took hold. The hobby only started in the early 60s. And so books were coming out throughout the 60s. They were being saved from, trash bins and discovered in, old garages at that point. And grade wasn't really a factor. The Overstreet, when it first came out in 1970, it only had 3 grades. I think we had, 27? So, it's been an evolution in the grading process. And part of that's due to collectors wanting the minutia of grading has become such a big factor. Obviously as values have risen, it's become important to differentiate between, grades or break it down even further. So yeah, but the grading, yeah, probably the 80s was when grading became a big thing. You started seeing value increases between the grades, significant value increases, and from that also restoration became a big thing too. So by the 90s, I think that had fully taken hold, and the groundwork was set for a company like CGC to come in.
No, cool. Well, thank you very much.
Sure, no problem. Thanks for having me.